Ladies and gentlemen, we'll proceed with the program. Our next speaker is Congressman Jim Heintz of the 4th District of Connecticut. Congressman Heintz is serving his first term in the House of Representatives, member of the Financial Services Committee and the Homeland Security Committee. He is a founding member of the Spending Cuts and Deficit Reduction Working Group in the House. And somehow the idea that there is such a group gives me much comfort. I'm pleased to present to you Congressman Heintz.
Well, thank you, Bill, and good morning, everybody. It's a delight to be with all of you. I'm glad you're taking the time and devoting the energy necessary to think about this very difficult problem. You've heard a lot today about the policy and the substance, and I'm here briefly. I'm not here really to give you my recommendations on how we adjust the federal budget, revenue and costs and whatnot, or entitlements. Really, that's a much, much longer discussion, and frankly, at the end of the day, a technical issue. What I do want to do is give you some observations that I am perhaps uniquely qualified to make as a new member of Congress. I was also not in a state house prior to arriving in Washington and being elected. So much of what is perhaps taken for granted in the political apparatus is new to me, and so I have a little bit of a kind of emperor's new clothes ability to see through process. The other thing I would tell you is that I was for many years a professional negotiator doing M&A transactions, and so I have a sense for the process that leads to successful negotiations. And I want to really just touch briefly on not the policy issues, but the environment in which a successful negotiation around the most difficult to negotiate issue, which is this one, will take place. And I have two thoughts for you. One is that we have a massive education gap in this country about what it is we are talking about when we're talking about fiscal responsibility. And that's a dangerous thing that, with all due humility, would say you need to help us address. And secondly, I would say is that we have none of the underlying willingness to find common interest, to use the education which will allow us to enter into a principle-based negotiation. We don't have the political space to have the negotiation that is required. Let's face it, this is the worst of all negotiations. Nobody comes out of a discussion of any issue of taxation or spending or entitlement feeling any better than they did when they went into that negotiation. There really aren't a lot of win-wins here, except for those technocrats who just see virtue and perfection and efficiency. Most Americans, of course, are not like that. And so this is probably the most difficult negotiation, whether we're talking about defense or taxes or Social Security or Medicare, that we are to enter into. As background, I would tell you that I have become convinced, as a sort of new observer to the political process, that just as a market economy will over time tend to develop inflation, because it's a nice thing in general over the long run and reduce in fairly controlled amounts for people who see the value of their debts decline in a real way. A democracy, I would submit to you, probably over time will run deficits, because democracies are run by people like me who are doing what I will be doing for the next 30 days, which is getting in front of my constituency and saying, will you vote for me? And they will say, well, are you going to preserve my Social Security? Are you going to fund the F-22? Are you strong on terrorism? Will you give another $600 million for cancer research to the NIH? Will you keep my taxes low? I want wonderful roads, superb schools, the very best military money can buy, and I want really, really low taxes. Okay. Vote for me on November 2nd. So, education. I had David Walker, and paid some price with the left wing of my party for doing so, in my district for 3 large town hall meetings to do the following, which was to convince a very educated constituency that the solution to our fiscal problems does not lie, I'm going to minimize the politics up here today, but does not lie in the suggestion of some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, which is we simply eliminate earmarks. Fine, let's eliminate earmarks, and everybody in this room knows that that's a rounding error on our fiscal challenges. It lies at the end of the day, as you all know, in entitlement reform. Frankly, and I'm channeling David Walker when I say this, the budget itself, we'll get there. We will get there. When we return to robust growth and we return to the difficult work of actually getting the budget under control and thinking, well, we'll get there on the budget. Won't be easy, but I think we will. It is, of course, the unfunded liabilities in Medicare and Social Security that are the big problem and, of course, the most political difficult issue to address. Most Americans don't know that. And it's not a pleasant thing for them to learn either. It would be neat if we could simply trim the Pentagon's budget by 5%, which, let's face it, we could probably figure out a way to do. It would be neat if we could eliminate earmarks in half the foreign affairs budgets and boom, be done with it. But as everybody in the room knows, that doesn't begin to address the magnitude, by several orders of magnitude, of the problem. So I entered into this effort, and it was a really amazing experience. And you need to, through the work that you do and through the media, get the process of education going and keep us focused on what really, really matters. Because again, if you watch TV, if a Martian were to land and watch 2 hours of cable news, the implication would be that doing those little things that I just talked about would make the difference. The second thing, which is a little bit more complicated, is how do we create the political space for a negotiation in which nobody wins? It's a negotiation which at the end of the day is allocating who bears what pain over what period of time. And that's never fun. Right now, there doesn't begin to exist the political space to do that. As a new member of Congress, I figured, well, okay, the stereotype is that the Republicans will under no circumstances contemplate any changes to the tax code, anything that even reeks, that even smacks of a tax increase, and however many of them, 200 plus, have signed pledges to not raise ever any taxes or to do away with any deductions ever. This is the Grover Norquist pledge. And on my side, on the Democratic side, I would never contemplate cuts of any kind. So Bill made reference to a group that 4 of us, 3 freshmen and a sophomore, put together to say, no, let's start that discussion. Here are $70 billion in cuts over 10 years that show that Democrats can offer up in good faith cuts. Some of them were really hard. We happen to have used the White House's proposals for cuts. These were cuts that were not taken up by the Congress or reversed in the Congress, so it wasn't all that hard to do from a policy standpoint. The executive agency had proposed these things previously. And it was interesting as a Democrat to see what then happened. You know, when we held a press conference and talked about these things, everything was fine, and of course I heard some noise from the left wing or from transit advocates or from housing advocates. It wasn't until we had an amendment that was ruled in order that would have actually created some cuts, and I still to this day don't quite understand how that amendment was ruled in order, but that actually would have cut some money out of the transportation HUD budget, that all hell broke loose, and all hell broke loose. But nonetheless, we made an effort to say, look, as Democrats, we can actually propose some cuts in the hope that perhaps on the other side, we would have a more honest discussion about revenues. We'll see if that works or not. But just as I asked for a more intensive effort around education, this will work when thoughtful people take risks to demand honesty and responsibility of us. And I've heard David Walker say it. David Walker says, don't take pledges. And as a negotiator, I know it's not a good idea in a tough negotiation to start with ultimatums. Don't take pledges. If everybody's out there taking pledges, eventually the math simply does not work. Or, to make the math work, you now need to do something pretty uncomfortable, which is to violate a pledge that you have taken. I would love to see a world where right-leaning think tanks and left-leaning think tanks and you know, on the extreme, it won't happen on the extremes, just come together and say, look, we may not like the outcome, but if our legislators box themselves in through pledges, there won't be a process. And so I would call and ask that you think hard about being very aggressive about creating that room by actually publicly humiliating people on both sides who box themselves in, on either side. I think that's really, really important. And I think that it is important to hold people's feet to the fire. I'll be even-handed in how I say this. On my side, from the left wing of my party, I get messages every once in a while saying, will you commit to lower the retirement age for Social Security? I said, wait, you mean raise the retirement? You mean not raise the retirement? No, lower the retirement age for Social Security, which I suppose there's a logic for that somewhere, but it certainly doesn't help this discussion. And on the other side, you know, you've got the Grover Norquist thing, or you've got the premise, the idea that I'm struggling with politically, that here's the statement that is being aimed at me as a fiscally responsible Democrat from the other side, from my opponent. I'm going to make make the 0103 tax cuts permanent, and I'm really the fiscally responsible guy in the room. You can't use those two premises in the same sentence. And you need, there are probably some supply-siders in the room who would say that you could, but I would point you to David Stockman and Alan Greenspan and the bulk of the economic profession, which is dispensed with, Arthur Laffer. You need to demand and hold us accountable for that kind of baloney on both sides. Because as long as we can get away with that baloney, we're going to try. Because we need to run for re-election. And we want to be able to offer guns, butter, and low taxes. So in summary, and I know we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. In summary, be aggressive about focusing the American people on the truth. It's a totally nonpartisan statement. On what moves the needle and what does not. On whether earmarks are important, whether it's really about Medicare and the reduction of healthcare costs, what the use of death panels as a way to characterize end-of-life discussions does for probably 10 years to that discussion within Medicare. By that discussion, I mean the larger discussion of over someone's lifespan from -9 months until 78 or whatever it is, what is the allocation of resources? Rationing, the word that someone like me never wants to offer. Sometimes for fun, in my healthcare town hall meetings, these were some meetings, when I would listen for an hour to, you're going to ration healthcare, you're going to ration healthcare, I would just for fun say, well, okay, the room, 3/4 of the room is outraged that we would that we would ration healthcare. First, does anyone believe in the room that unlike automobiles or food or any other good or service that human beings have been consuming for the last 5,000 years, does anybody really believe that every single American is going to get every single medical service and product that they want over the course of their entire life? And people would scratch their heads and say, no, probably not. Point made. And then question number 2, of course, was, is there anybody in the room who believes that we don't already ration health care? Well, we do. We don't do it systematically or based on any set of principles, but we do. And so this is the discussion that I would just implore all of you to have and to do and to be aggressive about holding other media outlets and elected officials to the truth. And as I said before, to not doing and not saying and doing and saying those things which create political space for what is, as I said before, a negotiation where everybody walks out feeling a little bit worse. So I think if we can do those two things, and I think what happens on November 2nd will either get us closer or further from that, and here I need to be a little bit partisan. I think that if the Republican Party, we know what's going to happen in the Democratic Party in Congress. We are likely to lose a bunch of our more moderate members in districts in the South and whatnot, so we will probably on balance have a smaller and slightly more left-leaning caucus. On the right, within the Republican caucus, I think it's all about the Tea Party. I think that if the perception is, after November 2nd, that the Tea Party hurt the Republican Party, which one man's guess is that that's probably the likely outcome, that the flirtation with the Christine O'Donnells and the Sharon Angles of the world actually resulted in the Republican Party doing far worse than they might have done at a moment in time when they were set up to really do some impressive things politically. If that's the perception, then I think that they move to the center a little bit and maybe set aside the flirtation with the extreme. If the reverse is true, if we see 20 Tea Party-oriented members, and my criticism of the Tea Party is not personal, it's simply about substance and ideas, then I think all bets are off. Then I think we've taken a very big step to actually removing common ground, what little common ground exists right now in the Congress. So thank you, Bill. I'm delighted to take a question too.
Yes, we have time for a question. Yeah.
I'm wondering, is part of the truth that the constituencies is that the main reason why we need to reform Social Security is that the money, the tax money that was dedicated to it was spent for other things, and that we're now in a situation where it's unattractive and maybe even difficult to borrow more? Or is it more than that? If it is more than that, what is it more? If it's not more than that, how do you sell that?
Well, I think the underlying issue around Social Security is the aging of the population, and the fact that lifespans have grown at a rate far in excess of the retirement age. And the way people think about Social Security has changed. And that's an interesting thing. It's both how people think about Social Security, which is I don't need to save money because I'll have Social Security. Social Security, of course, was never designed to be what it is today, which is the primary source of income for, I'll get my number wrong here, but it's 70 or 80% of American retirees. It was never designed to be that. But it has become that, partly because of the way people think, but partly also because if you look at wages in this country, for anything below the top 10%, if you look at wages in this country, wages have been flat on a real basis. There has not been as much opportunity as one would hope to actually save. And of course, there's 10 other reasons why we don't save enough. But the fact that the money was not put in the proverbial lockbox matters, but it doesn't matter that much. Because at the end of the day, Social Security relies on the full faith and credit of the federal government. That's a whole other topic. But we were never going to invest that money, with Alpha producing 12% annual rate of return investment. So we were always going to invest that money at the rate at which treasuries are paid. And so I actually think that's the lesser of the issue. It's more about the aging of the population and the fact that we have not saved nearly enough over a couple of generations. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, sorry, I'm Jean from CNN Money. You talk about an education gap with the public. I sort of see that firsthand in the stories that I read about these issues. Is there still a huge education gap among your colleagues in the House and those you might know in the Senate? Is that education gap narrowing, or are politicians who come out and say, make tax cuts permanent, lower retirement, do they really mean that, or they're just claiming it?
One of the things I've learned about my 535 colleagues is that they're pretty representative of the American people in a lot of ways. And so, yes, there is a subset of my colleagues for whom there probably is an education and understanding gap. But that's not as important, frankly, as the, let's call it, political courage gap right now, or the willingness to sort of part with party orthodoxy gap. You heard from Congressman Ryan earlier. I don't agree with some of the things that he has proposed, but I have a lot of respect for the fact that he actually proposed them, because he proposed some things that were pretty easy to attack. And his party, of course, has not embraced his plan, even though it's and again, ideologically, I have some real problems with some of the things in it, but it's a plan that is ideologically consistent with where his party has been, but his party didn't embrace it because it includes some of those tough decisions and tough things that are at least there to be talked about. So I would say that it's less about education with members of Congress than it is in providing us the safety, the platform, and the assurance that there will be a constituency there who respects us for saying hard things that people don't want to hear. And I think on that note, I need to say goodbye and thank you very much.